The Annex on Normalization is the last annex to be signed together with one addendum on the Bangsamoro waters. The discussion on normalization began in 2012, sometime November, and then it was concluded in January 2014. It is therefore important to look at the process both of negotiating the annex as well as the process itself of normalization. Normalization, you find that in the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. The reference there on normalization is that it is supposed to be a process that would bring communities back to peaceful, normal civilian life. The aim, as outlined in the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro, is to achieve human security, which is, of course, a complex concept developed by the United Nations Development Program, popularized in the Human Development Report in 1994 because of the senior advisor of the UNDP then, Mubalhaq, in 1994. He was the one who developed the concept that you now find in the annex, or rather in the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. So it is not as simple as the concept of disarmament, demobilization, or reintegration of combatants. It's more than that, because what has been outlined in the Annex on Normalization really is a process towards achieving human security. And human security consists of the 7 freedoms that you find in the concept. First is the freedom from poverty, freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from environmental degradation, and freedom from violence, and the freedom to participate in the political processes. So it outlines a process that is quite complex, and the ends appears to be political rather than purely security, because that is indeed the intention. You would note that the MILF has been very consistent in the use of the term normalization and a conscious effort to avoid DDR. And there is reason for that. Primarily because in early 2000, you remember, after the attack in Maguindanao, I think it was Bulyok Complex, the president then, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, said that she will no longer engage in peace negotiations with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and that she would deal with the MILF in the framework of a DDR, which is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And so it is important to note the deliberate distinction that has been made in the annex as well as in the concept developed by the Moro Islamic Liberation Front between normalization and DDR. The basic distinction is that normalization, the end as outlined in the framework agreement, is really to achieve human security. In DDR, the aim is quite simple. It's disarmament and demobilizing combatants. Normalization focuses more on the attainment of a political solution to the conflict. DDR focuses more on providing a security solution to the conflict. Normalization also differs from DDR in terms of sequencing, and this is important in the Annex on Normalization. In DDR, you begin delivering socio-economic packages only after disarmament has been achieved. And therefore, combatants would receive only after they have been disarmed and demobilized. There's a time they would receive socio-economic packages. In normalization, that is not the sequence. The sequence is we would simultaneously undertake socio-economic development projects while we undertake the process of decommissioning. or putting the weapons beyond use. The Annex on Normalization actually outlines the process of the implementation of the peace agreement. You find, for instance, under Phase 1, there is a need to address security concern in the Bangsamoro. And so you find a transitional security arrangement in the interim. So you form the Joint Normalization Committee, which would be the overall coordinator of all the processes inside normalization. Under the JNC, you find a specific body that is tasked to coordinate the security component of the normalization. That is your Joint Peace and Security Committee. Under it, under that committee, would be the operating troops, which is actually quite novel in this peace process, because meaning we've not followed the 1996 paradigm of integrating combatants into the Philippine National Police and the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And there's a reason for that. The MILF has been asserting this is a conflict founded on the right of the Bangsamoro to self-determination. And it would oppose any attempt to integrate the MILF into the mainstream of the Philippine infrastructure, Philippine bureaucracy, and Philippine government, which is why it was never a demand of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in this negotiation that their forces become members of the armed forces or of the Philippine National Police. What has been agreed under the Annex on Normalization on transitional security arrangement is to allow a partnership in addressing peace and order issues in the Bangsamoro, as well as the other important processes in normalization, so that we can utilize both the resources of government and that of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So you have a joint peace and security team consisting actually of 3 parallel security infrastructures in the Bangsamoro. One would be the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the other would be the Philippine National Police, and that of the Bangsamoro Islamic Armed Forces, the armed wing of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. As we move towards a more normal and peaceful life in the Bangsamoro, there has to be some readjustments of the deployment of security forces in the Bangsamoro. So as we move towards decommissioning, meaning putting the weapons and the combatants of the MILF beyond use, we may not need substantial number of the armed forces in the Bangsamoro, because there would not be sufficient force that is there to fight against government. We will now be pursuing development and transforming Moro communities into peaceful and civilian communities, and therefore there is no need for so many numbers of the armed forces of the Philippines. Parallel to that then, there would be redeployment of the armed forces from the conflict areas to where it is best utilized. Therefore, there can be a parallel rethinking of the security priorities in the Philippines, in this country. For a long time, the armed forces of the Philippines, which is supposed to be the protector of its people, have been used against its own people. And for some valid reasons, because, for instance, of the secessionist movement in Mindanao, the communist movement in the Philippines, and some other hostile problems. That is understandable. But there is sufficient reason now to rethink the security priorities of this country. So hopefully then, we would be maintaining peace and order in the Bangsamoro through a civilian police force called the Police Force for the Bangsamoro, which would be civilian in character, and that it is not designed as a fighting force against its own people. It is supposed to be for the protection of its own people. The armed forces then may move towards securing the borders of the country. One important process also in normalization is the issue of how do we, for instance, convince the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to decommission if we still have private armed groups whose firearms may even be more powerful than that of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and at times that of the Philippine National Police. So there has to be a program of addressing the issue of private armed groups. And in the Annex of Normalization, you would also find a partnership between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the security forces of government, Philippine National Police and Armed Forces of the Philippines, so that together, in partnership, it can actually address the issue of private armed groups. Because if we don't address that, we will continue to have challenge on convincing Moro Islamic Liberation Front commanders to decommission. Where you have a neighbor who carries several firearms, it may be difficult for you really to part with your firearms, put it beyond use. Also, as part of the process, you have to address the issue of MILF who may have been arrested, who may have pending cases, and who might have been issued warrants of arrest. Because there can be no normalization if we continue to have people, very senior officials of the MILF, facing charges in courts. And we have had experience with that one, both in the signing of the FAB, where we would need to bring senior commanders of the MILF to Malacanang Palace who have pending warrants of arrest. So it is just natural that as part of the confidence-building measure for government, we will have to address that one. And the way to go would really be one amnesty and the other one is pardon. There can be some other processes by which we can expedite the process of settling the cases filed against senior members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. The other one really is, as a confidence-building measure, the original negotiating point then was to return the camps to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Camp Abu Bakar, for instance, Camp Umar, Camp Badr, and some of these camps, which were captured in the wars of 2000 and 2003. We have had difficulty both in the negotiation for the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro, as well as in the Annex on Normalization, how to go about the issue of police force for the Bangsamoro. And therefore, the parties instead agreed to constitute an independent commission from outside who have had experience in developing a police force for certain communities moving out of conflict, Northern Ireland, for instance, and some other countries that have moved from conflict to development. And so for policing, the idea really is that for securing the Bangsamoro, there would be a police force for the Bangsamoro that is dedicated to addressing peace and order there, so that we can utilize the armed forces to some other function. And that because there would probably be a security vacuum if you don't have security forces from government as well as the active forces of the MILF because of the decommissioning process, we will have to gradually build a police force for the Bangsamoro. The Independent Commission on Policing, chaired by Canada, submitted actually its report and its recommendation last April 15. Some of the recommendations have actually been incorporated into the proposed basic law. But some would really require a legislative enactment, which would be more proper either to Congress or to the Parliament of the Bangsamoro. So essentially, that's how the process moves. There is one item there, transitional justice. But what you need to know about transitional justice is that initially in the discussions, we wanted really to set up immediately a mechanism to address the issue of human rights violations and correcting historical injustice. Unfortunately, there has been serious disagreements with government on how to go about addressing transitional justice issues. Because of that, the parties decided instead to create a commission that would essentially study the appropriate mechanisms for addressing transitional justice. And we perfectly understand the difficulty of tackling transitional justice, and that it is probably more appropriate to allow sufficient time to carefully study and then make recommendations for the appropriate mechanisms for addressing it. So it would involve looking into human rights violations in the past, looking into government policies that actually have resulted into the problems in Mindanao. So settlements of lands, the issue of legislations that have actually prejudiced the indigenous communities as well as the Bangsamoro in the grant of land titles to communities in Mindanao as well as in the Bangsamoro. So that would come in the form of a recommendation from the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission. It would be submitted to the panel. The panel would take action on the recommendations, and some of the recommendations might need actually legislation. For the phases in normalization, it is linked to the political process, meaning the enactment, for instance, of the Bangsamoro Basic Law, the setting up of the police force for the Bangsamoro, which would assume the establishment of a Bangsamoro government. So some of the movements here actually is linked to the political process, which is why I am saying the process of normalization is actually, in reality, captures the entire implementation of the agreement, such that when some parts of the agreement is not implemented, some of the processes inside normalization may not happen. The last phase being the signing of an exit agreement. 2 months before that, the parties would meet in Kuala Lumpur. The third-party monitoring team, which is tasked to monitor the compliance of both parties of its commitments, would meet in Kuala Lumpur with the facilitator and determine if indeed the parties have actually complied with their commitments. If both parties are satisfied that the agreement has actually been implemented, all of the agreements have been implemented, then they will sign an exit agreement, terminating then the negotiation process, as well as many of the mechanisms actually established under normalization. So when an exit agreement is signed, there is an assumption that the Bangsamoro government has been established, and all of the transitional arrangement that have been outlined in normalization would end. Thank you very much.